Thank you, Marilyn. Hi, everybody. I'm David Matthews. I'm the international editor at Science Business, and I'm here to hopefully rouse you from the post-lunch dip with a very invigorating conversation about a really important topic, which is, will the world still be working together on science and technology in 2050? So to set the scene for this, in parallel to strains on economic globalization, I think over the past 10 years we've certainly seen strains on, I guess, what you might call scientific globalization. So there are barriers going up to research between different countries, and I mean that's been triggered by fairly obvious events, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. But I think more importantly, it's also one of the central issues is the rise of China as a kind of military and technological power. And that's caused concern in the EU and the US and some other countries about whether they should be working with China in the same way as they did in the 2000s and the 2010s and so on. But what we want to ask here is, okay, so there are these new barriers, but how can we recalibrate our scientific relationships globally? So even with geopolitical rivals potentially, so that they remain mutually beneficial and we can tackle the global challenges. You heard this a million times before, but we all need to work together to tackle climate change, pandemics, and so on. I think everyone would agree. So how can we make these scientific relationships stable? So I've got a great international panel to discuss this issue with, so I'll just introduce them quickly. So first we have Jerry Sheehan, who is director of the OECD's Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate. Hi, Jerry. We have Phil Mwaha, who is Director General of South Africa's Department of Science and Innovation. We have Makiko Naka, who is Executive Director of Japan's RIKEN. And we have also Kurt Vandenberg, who is Director General of DG Klima in the European Commission. So I think just to set the scene, I'll start with Jerry, who can give us an overview, perhaps, of are barriers to scientific collaboration across the world going up, and if so, why?
Okay, thank you very much. Happy to be able to participate on today's panel, and this question is one that we have been looking at very closely at the OECD, and maybe I'll just make 3 points quickly at the beginning of the panel. I think first, as you were just saying, David, it's clear that international collaboration in science and technology is increasingly important. In fact, we could say it's more important now than almost ever before for a couple of reasons. One, as you were noting, we're asking more of science and technology today. We're using science and technology, not, quote, just to produce knowledge, but it's seen as a key lever for helping us address climate transition, combating biodiversity loss, making an energy transition, and so forth, preserving the oceans. We've got societal needs and missions that we need to deploy science and technology to respond to. At the same time, we're also developing new technologies, emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, synthetic biology, that offer us great promise and potential for these concerns and others, but at the same time, they raise their own concerns, right, about their questions of societal, ethical, and legal issues around equity, around data privacy, cybersecurity, and so forth, all of which span national borders, and we need international collaboration, cooperation to help us address those concerns and also just unleash the potential of these technologies. But as you said, the international collaboration in S&T is getting a little bit more difficult. We saw that somewhat through the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw changing patterns of collaboration with recent disruptions, including the war of aggression against Ukraine, current conflict in the Middle East, growing concerns about China and other countries with sometimes security and other times economic concerns. They're creating a lot of risk, uncertainty, and to some extent, what we're calling across OECD a securitization of science, technology, and innovation policies, right? We're trying to put more controls. At the same time, we're trying to have more open engagement and open science. We're trying to ensure that we know who that openness is with, and it's changing sometimes the partners with whom countries are engaging in scientific and technical collaboration. But I think at the same time, and the third point I'd want to make is that this change is also, I think, a great opening and a great opportunity. So while we focused a lot on the competition and so forth among largely the OECD and developed economies, there's an increasing level of collaboration going on with other emerging economies. And this is happening, again, in areas around combating the climate change and trying to get us into a green transition, also around trying to promote innovation in artificial intelligence. So we at OECD support something called the Global Partnership on AI. It's no surprise, it's chaired this year by India, and we've got great participation from Argentina, Brazil, Senegal, Singapore, and other countries as well. We're seeing this as well. We're working with the African Union, developing an AI strategy for the continent. And in a meeting of our Committee for Scientific and Technological Policy that'll be meeting in just a couple of months at a ministerial level, we have engagement we're hoping from South Africa as well from a number of other emerging economies. And I think that's a deepening of that engagement that, again, we need around these issues of technology governance as well as using S&T to help us solve some of the biggest challenges we face.
Okay, thanks. That's a really great overview. Thank you. I think probably the audience will be pretty familiar with as you say, the securitization of some aspects of research in Europe and the US. But Makiko, can you give us a short appraisal of the situation in Japan? Is it getting harder to work with certain countries in Japan?
Yes, like in terms of steps that you have to follow or the regulations that you have to follow, well, it's getting harder. Well, the Japanese government worked very hard for the integrity of research, and they set up a guideline in 2021 April, which is for researchers and research organizations and research funding organization, and we have to follow. Right. And also in last year, when Japan took a role of hosting country of G7, well, they had a meeting, ministerial meeting, 7 countries, member countries come to get together and discussed how they get along with these guidelines. And as for RIKEN, which is National Institute of Natural Sciences, well, it's supported by government and, it's supported by people's tax money. So we have to keep our trust with those government and people. So we, last year, established a new headquarters, which is for, to take care of integrity of research and as well as economic security. And we, of course, follow these guidelines so that we can protect our researchers from getting into trouble that is expected or unintentionally. And but we think there should be some balance. And one thing we think strength is RIKEN is doing very basic research. And basic research always have to be open, and of course, outcomes should be open by a journal papers or a publication. So I think we have to use this kind of a strength. Thank you.
Okay, so clearly this whole securitization agenda extends to Japan, not just Europe and the US. Phil, if I could turn to you, I mean, I'm clearly not an expert on South African foreign policy, but South Africa has strong links with Europe through Horizon Europe, for example, and there's various just transition programs. But South Africa is also a member of the BRICS with Russia and China, India, etc. How does South Africa, given its slightly different geopolitical position, approach research security? Can you just kind of pick and choose who you want to work with, or do you have research security concerns as well?
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to come and say a few words. But before I respond to your question, just give me 1 minute to explain our science and innovation policy. 1 minute. We've just finalized a document which we call a decadal plan for science, technology, and innovation, 2021 and 2031. To simplify it, it works in 2 legs. The one leg is just science for the sake of science, because we have a small science system and we want to continue to build that science system. The second leg is where we would like to harvest the knowledge from the science system for some of the economic opportunities. So in the first case, where it's science for science, as Japan does, we can collaborate with anyone because I think it's well known. In fact, there are a number of global initiatives where we work with everybody on global problems such as the square kilometer array, as you know. We are participating in something called the Group on Earth Observation, trying to understand how the Earth system works. A number of countries are participating in that. Now, on the second leg, that's where things get a little bit more complicated. And the reason for that is because we have embarked in South Africa on a program to reindustrialize the country. What that means is that in areas where we think we can have comparative advantage, we then use our department, Science and Innovation, to work with other government departments such as Trade, Industry and Competition to look at how knowledge is going to impact society. And I'll give one or two examples if you give me time. The first one is the development of batteries for the electric vehicles and storage.
Yeah.
Now, if you know, South Africa in particular has 80% of the world good grade of manganese and nickel, all right? So what we are looking for are partners who will work with us. Of course, we will mine those minerals, but how do we add value into the batteries? So we have a program, for instance, where we're trying to look at what we call precursor materials for these anode and cathode in the batteries, and now they've got to be industrialized and take them to market. So there we choose partners on the basis of whether they support our industrialization program.
Right.
So Europe has a great opportunity to work with South Africa, with the knowledge institutions, because you already have partners who are building, for instance, electric vehicles in South Africa. Very big ones, BMW and others. So we've started to talk to them to say, how can we start to create the supply chains that are needed for this transition that's happening in e-mobility. Of course, within the SADC region, if we extend this beyond South Africa, we also have countries around the SADC region that have got lithium, and as you know, it's also important. So I think as the geopolitics change, we also look at our foreign policy in the light of these energy transitions that are happening. If you then ask me, are we choosing partners in Europe and are we choosing partners in the BRICS countries? It's on a case-by-case basis.
Right, okay.
Right? For instance, with Europe, we are extremely grateful on the partnership we have to build the vaccine capability in South Africa and then in partnership with the rest of low-medium income countries. Glenda Gray in the session earlier on talked about World Health Organization, Medicine Patent Pool, Africa CDC, to use the mRNA platform to develop vaccine capability in South Africa. So I hope I've answered your question that the partnership is based on, can you help us to reindustrialize on open science? On science, it's open. And then, of course, we are not working on quantum computing as well as next generation of micro chips, and therefore those areas where the security is probably very important, not yet. We're just doing that work.
So it's case by case and about South African reindustrialization, basically. Okay, very interesting. Okay, maybe, yeah, turn to you, Kurt. Let's start talking about, okay, how can we build these partnerships in a safe and reciprocal, which I think often is the word the Commission uses, way. Now, coming from DG Klima, clearly climate change, it's an absolute, almost a platitude by this point, but to say that we need to work together to create green technologies to prevent the planet from frying. What, however, is the approach of the European Commission, or indeed the framework programs, if you want to collaborate with China, for example, on green technologies, be it batteries, new solar, hydrogen, maybe even fusion? Because on the one hand, you're both building something that's beneficial for the Earth, but these are also technologies where there's a huge kind of industrial pot of gold at the end of it if one country manages to, as China has done with solar, actually become the world's leading manufacturer of these green technologies. So how should the EU approach that, where there's both an environmental impetus to work together, but there's also some kind of industrial competition?
Yeah, it's a very essential and strategic question. Let me first clearly say that for the EU, international research and innovation collaboration will always remain key. It is key and it will remain key for the various reasons that Jerry mentioned. That's especially the case for climate. I think stability of our climate is a common good, so we have no choice but to cooperate internationally. Actually, the best de-risking strategy for humanity and the global economy is cooperation. We're very clear about this. And we also need a fair dose of competition. We welcome competition because that stimulates excellence and really makes sure that we progress. So that will always be key for the EU. Nevertheless, what we see is that the global context is changing, is transforming. Some countries are seeking technological leadership through discriminatory measures. Others are instrumentalizing research and innovation for global influence. And this is very challenging for a jurisdiction like the European Union. There's probably no jurisdiction that has more multilateralism in its DNA than the European Union. And you mentioned China. China is one case in point where the mutual trust is waning. We see that there is a possibility of unfair subsidies that are being given and no mutual access to markets. Our trade deficit with China climbed to 400 billion euros or dollars last year, which is a clear sign. What we need to realize is that with our climate and energy legislation, Fit for 55, we are creating a massive market for clean tech and green solutions in the future. That market will be there, it will be massive. But we can't sustain this if that market is only supplied from China or the US, for example. So what do we do then in terms of research and innovation collaboration? Well, I think we want to lead by example by having a rules-based multilateralism and aiming for reciprocal openness in research and innovation collaboration. What this means is that for us, we try to follow the line that we are as open as possible and restricted where necessary. So openness balanced with safeguarding EU interests in strategic areas. But what is very important is that we want to be rules-based about this, not just like this because we don't like an area. It has to be transparent, predictable, and rules-based. It means, for example, in our Horizon work programs, that we identify upfront certain areas for innovation actions close to market, where legal entities established in China are not eligible to participate, mostly justified on the grounds of uncertain IPR protection. But having said this, and I'll close with this, China remains for us a very important partner in tackling global challenges like climate change. When we visited China in April with President von der Leyen, the Chinese leadership, Li Qiang, the Prime Minister, said clearly, green will be the color of our collaboration. So that's the line we follow, as open as possible, but closed where necessary.
But does that green collaboration extend to things like solar, batteries, this kind of stuff, where there is this industrial component as well that we're all trying to kind of
Well, let me say that we're getting very, very careful in these areas.
Okay.
And we are working with China on a joint research and innovation roadmap, where we try to identify what are the common principles and rules for working together. As far as the basic science is concerned, we have mostly agreed these principles. When it comes to innovation, we see that China is very reluctant. So we refrain from cooperating in those strategic areas like batteries, electric vehicles, as long as China is not signing up to this joint roadmap. But we still hope that we will get there to have a common understanding.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, maybe if I could turn back to you. I mean, from the OECD's kind of more global perspective, what are the costs, though, if we don't collaborate on green tech? I mean, is it kind of a case of every country sort of having to reinvent the wheel within kind of closed markets, and so you have a green transition more slowly? What are the stakes here?
Well, I think the issue is trying to ensure that we do have more open collaboration around the green transition. I mean, building on what everyone has been saying. Decarbonization itself it's a collective challenge, and it's going to require a collective response. And I think on sort of from an S&T policy point of view, on sort of both sides of the coin, right? So we need to do more to help develop new technologies that are going to help us make the green transition. I think my colleagues at the International Energy Agency will remind us, right, that half the technologies for getting to our green targets through 2050 are going to come from technologies that are not yet ready for market adoption, right? They're still in the pipeline. And yet, as best we can tell, R&D expenditures around green tech are not even up to where they were for historical levels as a share of GDP from decades ago.
Really?
Patenting measures, again, I mean, these are all imperfect indicators of things, have also sort of flattened out in these areas. So, I mean, there is something of an incentive to try to do more, to develop more technology. And again, I think that will take players and participants from all corners of the globe. The other side, though, is also ensuring adoption of technologies as they are developed, which means going somewhat beyond the kind of the stricter confines of S&T policy, looking at some of the regulatory levers that can be used, looking at other market incentives that can be used, but recognizing, too, that adoption of technology often takes new infrastructures, takes new skill and new skill development. So it really does take, a whole of government approach to this. So I think within OECD, we're looking at this maybe from both sides of the coin, if you will. So in our work on science and technology policy, I mentioned this ministerial level meeting that we're organizing at the end of April. One of the things we'll be doing is asking ministers to adopt what we're calling an agenda for transformative science, technology, and innovation policy. How do we sharpen the tools of STI policy? How do we package them in the right sets? And in particular, how do we ensure that collaboration and coordination across governments to help advance? In particular, we're using green as the model, but you can think of other kind of major transitions that we want to make as a society. We've also done work on looking at incentives and mechanisms for adoption through two mechanisms that are now open beyond OECD membership: the inclusive framework on carbon mitigation strategies, and something my directorate supports called the Climate Club, which is again looking at how do we help really hard to abate sectors adopt green technologies. So think the steel sector and shipbuilding and others. How do we put in place, again, the new technologies, but what other kinds of supports and infrastructure are needed to help them develop? And we're trying to do that going beyond the OECD membership, recognizing that we need many, many players involved in these spaces.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, those are the stakes. If we don't collaborate, I mean, yeah, we get another degree, several degrees of global warming. Essentially, this is possibly the consequences of fracturing. But of course, there are concerns about reciprocity and industrial fairness. But, I mean, okay, if the world is fracturing in some areas, it's also possibly coming together in others. There are, ways we can build links between countries that are not rivals, but maybe haven't traditionally participated very strongly together. Can I return to you, Phil, a bit more about, I mean, you mentioned that South Africa kind of picks and chooses who it wants to collaborate with. Can you go into a bit more detail on that, about maybe in the hydrogen area, green hydrogen area? What do you want in terms of IP, knowledge transfer? I mean, I think you mentioned prior to this that you'd actually recently been speaking to the UK about the kind of framework with which you collaborate with the UK on this. So it'd be very interesting to hear, what do you want out of these kind of partnerships?
Yes, thanks very much. Having provided the earlier context and the two legs of the decadal plan in hydrogen, we started building knowledge in this area since 2009 in South Africa. So we have the knowledge for putting catalysts in the membrane, the most expensive part, because we have platinum.
Yeah.
We've been developing materials for infrastructure for hydrogen. Producing hydrogen is great, but make sure that you transfer and you move it to where it's supposed to be. It's important. And then, of course, to develop capability to integrate components to actually manufacture fuel cells. So we've done all of this. And we are now at the stage of looking for partners to work with us as part of our reindustrialization. So for instance, we work with Japan huge supporter of the work that we do. They have an interest, as you know, in the mobility and in the vehicles. It's one of the countries that really is pushing the boundaries around introducing fuel cell in the mobility, so we're working with them. They have a huge interest in ammonia. That's one of the things that we have an interest in South Africa, because as part of the just energy transition, if you use ammonia into the coal-fired power station, you are able to reduce the emissions that go out in the state.
Right.
So we're working with Japan on this.
Yeah.
With the UK, as you know, in one of the areas around Newcastle, they had British Steel, and then they had one of the big chemical industries. And therefore, they want to transform that area. So we've partnered with the UK 2070 Commission to exchange lessons learned, because as we transform our coal-fired power station in Mpumalanga in South Africa, we want to learn how they've done this. But in the process of doing that, we've been looking at this expertise that I've told you about on how they can start to introduce green hydrogen. For instance, in the Thames Valley, with the ships that are going around there, with sustainable aviation fuels and stationary applications. So we have identified living labs in both South Africa and the UK, where we are then looking at the exchange of knowledge, but also the exchange of the products through companies that we work with. But thirdly, South Africa has just to go back to your earlier point, that South Africa tends to collaborate with most countries in the world. We've just been the chair of the International Partnership for Hydrogen in the Economy, IPHE, which is a global group of countries that wants to really start to introduce hydrogen fuel cells in their economy. So in this particular example, again, open with everyone, but as I've said, we have our own, like I guess yourself, competitiveness of companies is important.
You mentioned all those, you seem to be happy with this partnership with Japan and the UK. I mean, are you seeing some of the things from the EU at all?
Yes, certainly. We would be more than happy to look at this partnership. In fact, at the moment, Germany has a good relationship with Namibia for historic reasons, right? So, but also next to Namibia, as you know, there's a province in South Africa called the Northern Cape. So it's got excellent radiation from the sun. So as you know, if you want to produce green hydrogen, you can use the sun, electrolysis, you can then produce hydrogen. So there's a project specifically as we speak between ourselves and Germany in the Northern Cape, where we are negotiating that the electrolysis process start to introduce some of the components that I've been talking about. So, so really, the partnership is not limited to anyone, as long as we agree on the outputs and the outcomes that are beneficial for both partners that want to work with South Africa.
Okay. I mean, one of the other ways that global collaboration is expanding is the expansion of Horizon Europe, which we've talked about a bit already. So Canada is going to join. New Zealand already has joined. Japan is still in negotiations. Makiko, I wonder what you can say. What are your hopes and expectations around this, and what would Japan like to see potentially to make this happen? Horizon Europe, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So there are so many global issues and problems that we have to tackle together. So I think it's very, very important to have such international funding system. And personally, I really wish that our researchers can join in that program with Japan being associate country, but actually it doesn't have happened yet. And so as a member of National Institute of, which is supported by government, we have to look and hope, and well, it may go in good way. But may I say one thing?
Yeah.
As Jerry said before, when something there's some difficulties or limitation, then there may be another way of doing it, or possibilities and development. And one thing that I want to say is Japan has recently devised Aspire program, which is an international funding system, another one. So maybe. For the time being, maybe you can use that system.
This is an alternative.
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
if Horizon
yeah.
Europe doesn't work out. Okay,
That's right.
interesting. Okay, yeah. Kurt, can I turn to you as well? I mean, are there any other countries that the EU, aside from the ones it's targeted through Horizon Association, that we should be working more with to counteract this trend in other areas of walls going up, maybe between the EU and China? I mean, maybe there's other areas of the globe we've neglected.
No, entirely so. We don't limit ourselves only to the associated countries, although I must say personally I'm very, very happy to see this dynamic of more countries associating to Horizon Europe. This is something we started with Horizon Europe, and it's starting to take shape. And I think we have an interest, all of us, to get more associated to a program like Horizon Europe. It's a no-brainer, if you ask me, and I think we've found the right modalities now to do this, so I would strongly hope that Japan would also join. But we go beyond the association to Horizon Europe. I think we have a global approach to research and innovation, where we try to modulate our cooperation with partner countries and regions. We try to have bilateral roadmaps in which we identify joint commitments, also agree on joint conditions for ensuring a level playing field and promote shared values. And one continent that is definitely close to our heart and to our interest is Africa, where recently in September with the Nairobi summit, the African Union and President Ruto in Kenya clearly said, we turn the page, Africa will become the continent of solutions for the green transition. And we work a lot now with African countries. We have a long-standing relationship with South Africa, of which we're very proud. That goes beyond research and innovation. We have a Just Energy and Transition Partnership, for example, but also with the rest of Africa. And you mentioned hydrogen. Just to give you an example of how we look at this, we have targets for renewable hydrogen by 2030, 10 million ton domestically produced and 10 million ton imported, especially from Africa. So this is a clear sign of how open we are to partnerships with the South, which really should be win-win partnerships. What we don't want is that these partnerships are extractive, as they have been in the past, but that they are for mutual benefit. And we are very keen to help our African partners climb up the industrial value chain, the sustainability ladder, so that the hydrogen produced is not only for exports to Europe, which of course is good for us, but also for local development, and that you leapfrog beyond fossil fuels. And our proposition is then that the European market will always be open to imports for products from Africa, as long as they are clean, green, and decarbonized. And in this way, we have a mutually win-win beneficial partnership, and that also extends to research and innovation. By the way, I could also expand on Latin America. I could expand on India, for example, with whom we're developing this collaboration. But win-win partnerships in all areas, including research and innovation, are for us a must.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If anyone has any burning questions on how do we keep scientific collaboration going despite geopolitical tensions, wars, pandemics, etc. Does anyone have a question from the audience? Yeah.
I think my name is Professor Van de Voorde. I was in the direction of CERN, also of Max Planck Institute, and also with Davignon. He called me from CERN to prepare the first framework program. I'm also founder of IMEC, one of the successes in Europe. I was just in Japan in October about an SDS meeting, and I think what Dr. Vandenberg said, the future of this program, of the new program, the 10th program, should be international. He was already indicating about Africa. It's very important to have this context to Africa. It is most important, a country like Japan, who has the same problems and the same intensives as Europe, we should have strong collaborations. And for the time being, that is very poor, the collaborations. I think that the future of the 10th program of Europe and the European Union is to go international, also with America and also with China, worldwide. It is so that in America and in Europe, we have no brains anymore. We have used all our brains. We have to find brains elsewhere, and that is a very important topic. Innovation, you can put anything, you can put money and everything, but you need brains. And in the case of IMEC, a very small institute at the university in Leuven, we have 130 countries who are working together to make from IMEC one of the best institutes in the semiconductor, in the nano-semiconductor in the world, thanks to the brains coming from 130 countries in Europe. And if we don't do it, Europe will be a loser. We and Japan, who are now just behind the United States, we will go a step downwards. And other countries will pass us. And we have to be careful for what is going on in Africa. This goes very quickly. And we have a lot of support, I know, from China, where I'm still professor at the Tsinghua University. And it is very dangerous also, as Russia is also putting a lot of money. And if we, Europe, are not making very special efforts, we will lose this big continent, and one has to make great efforts for it. So I think I have been for many years at the European Union, and I think the way, like Dr. Van den Berg just mentioned, that the European Union is now going outside the 28 countries or associated countries, I think a very special effort must be made. And I have been working many years with Switzerland, and I regret really that there are so many problems in order to put Switzerland and the European Union together in research and technology. What are we really doing in Europe? One has to be very careful for its future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I hope there's a few brains left in Europe, maybe some in this room. Okay, yeah, well, you raised a question. Maybe South Africa in Horizon Europe or the FP10, who knows? Would you like to respond?
Well, I can respond. I know you run out of time. We are very proud of the Europeans that are participating in the SKA.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that, yes, it's a telescope in the radio astronomy area. But what is interesting is that the technologies that you need to process the amount of data, which is 10 times the amount of data that is flowing through the internet, are technologies that have not been developed before. So yes, we are part of building astronomers, but the interesting things are the technologies. So that's one example, and I'm sure there are many, many, many other initiatives which I hope the Europeans are participating in ITER, so, and so forth. And sometimes it's not just what you build for fusion, but it's actually participation in understanding the technologies that you need for future. Similar discussion that happened this morning around the binary between basic research and applied research. So perhaps it's not that bad. There are some Europeans that are participating.
Hopefully not. Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to hand back over to my colleague Marilyn to introduce the next session. But could you all give our participants a round of applause, please? Thank you for the conversation.